I am going to start nonetheless on the arts pages of The Guardian, just as well as a Guardian journalist here, but I didn't know that was going to be the case. Last Saturday, that newspaper urged us to go and see David Gregg's new play, The Strange Undoing of Prudentia Hart, now touring pubs in Scotland. So that's an additional incentive to go to see it. The play is set, in the words of the paper's reviewer, in a world of academic pedants, a place of memes, signifiers, and post-structuralists, where the head triumphs over the heart every time. The story of the play is set in Kelso in the Scottish borders. The folk studies community has gathered there for a symposium on the Borders Ballad, neither border nor ballad, as the title of the symposium is. A title which, as the Guardian's reviewer pointed out, perfectly satirises the empty dichotomies of the career academic. The empty dichotomies of the career academic, it should strike a chill in all our hearts. That new academic discipline of security studies in particular. It can often seem, security studies that is, to confront us with the empty dichotomies of the career academic. For neither border nor ballad read neither war nor peace, or neither victory nor defeat. All are words which are in danger of going out of fashion as they become subsumed by the catch-all of security as it is increasingly understood. War is now more often called armed conflict, and not just by lawyers. States don't declare war, allegedly constrained by the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact, which prohibited the use of war as an instrument of national policy, except in matters of self-defense, and of course buttressed by the UN Charter of 1945, which appropriated to the Security Council the right to use force to maintain or restore international peace and security, with that same exception, that is to say, the right still reserved to individual members to go to war in cases of self-defense. Peace is also a word that has gone out of fashion. As we become less sure what war is, so we become less sure what peace is. The loosening of one definition seems to carry the corollary that we loosen the other. Peace is treated as utopian and idealistic, not least, as the empty dichotomies of career academics relativize, just to show I can use an awful word as well as most academics, relativize peace as they relativize border ballads. They miss a core reality, that each of us sitting here, or in my case standing here, has some grasp, I think, of what peace is. A grasp which is based on our actual experience of life as we live it. Most of us, most British citizens, and indeed most citizens of Europe, experience peace every day, and indeed every month and every year. We are essentially societies at peace. And if we don't think we are, then we have lost any sense of context, ignorant both of Europe's comparatively recent past and of what is going on in so many other parts of the world still today. I don't mean to suggest that there are not ambiguities in the relationship between war and peace. In ascending order of importance, they could include some of the following. First of all, of course, a state can be at war but still enjoy areas of peace. It was the frequent complaint of those who went home on leave to London or indeed had the chance to go to Paris during the First World War that the inhabitants of neither city seemed to know that there was a war on. There is a geographical distinction. That is a geographical distinction. There can also be a chronological break. There can be pauses during the war, something Clausewitz noted as distinctly odd, but nonetheless really quite frequent. And those pauses can either be informal, because the weather is quite simply too bad to carry on the fighting, or because armies are simply too exhausted to go on fighting, or they can be formal, because there is a negotiated ceasefire, or an armistice. And some such pauses can lead to a more permanent peace. Or, of course, they can go the other way. The sides take the opportunity to gather their resources and fortify their resolves in order to go on fighting. And then there can be countries that can be outwardly or formally at peace, not in a formal state of war with each other, but can still be fighting each other, as India and Pakistan do in Kashmir, or as the Thais and the Cambodians do along their frontier, or as Israel and its neighbours, Lebanon and Palestine, do from time to time. Moving up a gear, and I think more important in our understanding of what the relationship is and the integration, if you like, of war and peace, is that more profound and Hobbesian relationship between war and peace. The notion that society, whether our own domestic society or the society of states, international society, is fundamentally anarchic, and that man is given to competition and aggression. And so Hobbes' argument that the sanction of force is required to maintain the order which we call peace, and it is precisely the state's possession of the monopoly of armed force which creates that order. And finally, and consequently, but also with the circularity, I don't know if academics go around in circles as well as have dichotomies, but in my case I tend to go around in circles, but also with circularity, there is that issue of that personal experience of peace to which I have already referred. Because the presumption in the state's monopoly of force is that if that gives us peace, it uses that force wisely, and that sovereign authority is exercised by the state in the interests of the nation or of the community as a whole. On this reading, peace without justice is no peace. As John Stuart Mill put it, war is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest. The decayed and degraded state of moral and patriotic feeling which thinks nothing is worth a war is worse. A man who has nothing which he cares about more than his personal safety is a miserable creature and has no chance of being free unless made and kept so by exertion of better men than himself. That's not just an injunction to fight against domestic tyranny. It's not just a legitimization of civil war. It is also an injunction to international war. In 1943, in the middle of the Second World War, the US journalist and intellectual Walter Lippmann declared that, in his words, the survival of the nation in its independence and its security is a greater end than peace. As he explained, if the logic of peace as the supreme national ideal leads to absurdity, then it must be a grave error to think and to say that peace is the supreme end. Lippmann came from a democratic state fighting a war which we now see as a war for democracy. But his sentiments echo the response of Clausewitz in February 1812 as he rejected the French demand that the Kingdom of Prussia contribute troops for Napoleon's invasion of Russia. In Clausewitz's view, and he was not alone, France, not Russia, was Prussia's enemy, and so Prussia must fight rather than submit to Napoleon's request. As he wrote, "I believe and confess that a people can value nothing more highly than the dignity and liberty of its existence, that it must defend these to the last drop of its blood, that there is no higher duty to fulfill, no higher law to obey." And he concluded, "I believe that a people courageously struggling for liberty is invincible, that even the destruction of liberty after a bloody and honourable struggle assures the people's rebirth. It is the seed of life which one day will bring forth a new, securely rooted tree." The moral challenge created in these words is reflected in their explicit Christian analogies and the reference to the creed contained in the preface repeated throughout the document, "I believe." As James Turner Johnson has repeatedly, albeit controversially, argued, the Christian just war tradition can too easily be seen as a norm predisposed to favour our not fighting. The just war tradition, he claims, also creates an expectation that if the cause is just, as Clausewitz clearly believed Prussia's to be in 1812, or Lippmann believed that of the United States to be in 1943, then we are obliged to fight. This is a moral challenge, not just because it confirms that our understanding of what peace is may require us to use war to sustain it. It is also a moral challenge because it is an argument that itself can be used for ends which are unequivocally immoral. The passage from Clausewitz I have just quoted, and this is a point to which I referred in my first lecture, was the only quotation from Clausewitz used by Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf. Just over 20 years later, on the 18th of March 1945, Hitler, at least subconsciously, evoked the same themes when he said to Albert Speer, "If the war is to be lost, the nation will also perish. This fate is inevitable. There is no need to consider the basis even of a most primitive existence any longer. On the contrary, it is better to destroy even that and to destroy it ourselves." The dilemmas between war and peace which we face today are never, or rarely ever, put in terms which are so patriotic as those favoured by Walter Lippmann in 1943. But the rhetoric used by Hitler does, of course, find its comparator in the call to arms of jihadi websites. Moreover, the fact that we, or you are sitting and I'm standing, here in the Mill Lane lecture rooms in a situation which we can reasonably and legitimately, in my view, call peace, unless you get really angry with me, doesn't mean that there aren't citizens of Britain, and probably of most other states represented here this evening, serving, fighting, killing, and potentially dying in a war in Afghanistan. British citizens may rightly feel themselves to be at peace. British serving personnel equally rightly feel themselves to be at war. It is precisely because the gulf between the daily experiences of most of those who live in Western societies, of those who defend them, and those who defend them is so great. It is precisely for that reason that we are under pressure to soften our conceptual awareness of the distinction between war and peace. That softening and our uncertainty as to which is the prevailing condition of our times, war or peace, is the means to enable those of us who live relatively secure lives, that is the majority of us, to appreciate the efforts of those who do not, and to understand that our security rests on a concept of international order and a readiness to fight and defend it. Thus, the current edition of British Defence Doctrine, another document to keep you awake at night, published in January 2010, states that, in its words, neither peace nor war are, just to show that grammar is not a strong point in doctrine writers, neither peace nor war are absolute, nor are they necessarily opposites of each other, being but different means of achieving the same end, that of policy. Instead, they represent a continuum or notional spectrum. British defence doctrine begins not with definitions of defence or even of war, but with definitions of security. Human security, the United Kingdom's security, collective security. Security has replaced both defence and strategy as the key word to shape our thinking about war. War, instead of being distinct and different, a polar opposite to peace, has become subsumed within a range of threats, some to us as individuals, some to nations, some to the world as a whole. Security is a concept which subordinates war. It is lumped not just with other violent products of human agency, like crime or terrorism, but with very different phenomena which do not involve direct assaults by human beings on each other, and some of which may not even be the products of human design, but of naturally occurring events. War is treated as on a par with flooding or drought, tsunami or earthquake. Climate change is at the centre of the security debate, not just because the degree of human responsibility within that is contested, but also because threats to our supplies of food, fuel and water may in turn affect the appetite of states or even of non-state actors for war and armed conflict. And it is not clear precisely how that relationship might work. If we put all the security challenges on a spectrum that runs from whether we die in our beds from old age to the less likely probability of our dying in war, if we do that, we are in danger of so conflating the challenges that confront us that we may fail to distinguish between threats that we can manage or even prevent and those for which the best we can hope is that we can mitigate their consequences. We are just as much in danger of securitizing every problem as our immediate predecessors were of bellicizing international relations through nuclear deterrence, or our 19th century forebears of militarizing their societies in anticipation of a major European war. Now, this is not a rant directed against the security studies fraternity, or not just against them. It is also directed against the practitioners of public policy, because the tendency to lump threats rather than disaggregate them is present in government too. One example will suffice to show both how persuasive the securitization, to use that terrible word, that securitization of our thinking has become, and how ideas move from academic fraternities to policy practice. That example is Joe Nye's concept of soft power. Now, Joe Nye is, in the eyes of most liberals and most academics, on the side of the angels. And I don't want to dislodge him from that celestial pedestal, not least when he is a former Rhodes Scholar and currently a visiting professor at Oxford. But consider what happens when you bring ideas from Harvard into government, as he has done through his service in the Clinton administration. Soft power embraces the cultural, economic, and educational activities of a state or community and sees them as agents of influence rather than as goods in their own right. Thus, the nostrum in defence circles, including as in the British defence doctrine, is that hard and soft power are two sides of the same coin, united by a common object, and that common object is the exercise of national power. It is not that hard power's ultimate sanction is war, and so is radically different from soft power, which uses means whose ends are themselves inherently benign and even pacific. Soft power co-opts peaceful activities in situations and for purposes in which states might alternatively have been ready to use force. And that is precisely the grounds used by those who criticise Nye. He underestimates the power of war to change things and exaggerates the influence of cultural contact to do so. After all, in 1914, European states shared much in terms of education, academic research, and the arts. Those products of peace were promptly marshalled for national purposes to support the war in August of that year. The sort of sloppy thinking that can result from this conflation of threats and minimizing of distinctions is best exemplified by the 2008 British National Security Strategy, mercifully improved both in the Labour government's revised version of 2009 and even more by the coalition's effort of last year, 2010. The 2008 National Security Strategy used apocalyptic vocabulary about a range of global problems for which the UK cannot by itself produce solutions. Therefore, it was not by and large about national security. But alongside all the global threats, climate change, epidemics, natural disasters and so on, were glib and reassuring sentiments about the improbability of major war, certainly insofar as it might affect the United Kingdom and even Europe. The overwhelming impression created by the 2008 National Security Strategy is that we indeed live in an insecure and dangerous world. The paradoxical subtext is that we in the United Kingdom do not actually do so, even allowing for the threat of domestic terrorism. This lack of precision is fraught with consequences because of its failure to analyse and disaggregate real threats from putative threats, national security challenges from global concerns, and above all, war from peace. Put simply, and now I really am going to get on to the subjects of victory and defeat, if we cannot distinguish war from peace, then we will not know how to end war. This failure carries three particular consequences. The first is that war is different from the other dangers to global security. War's key characteristic, and forgive me if I've said this earlier in these lectures, war's key characteristic is that it is a clash of wills where the danger arises from the enemy and his determination to counter your own intentions. It is a reciprocal relationship, and it is in that reciprocity that war derives its own inherent dynamic. War's deliberate use of armed force makes it different from the challenges posed by the natural world or even by other aspects of human interaction, such as economic competition. The fact that the currency of war is violence done by one human being to another itself fundamentally changes relationships between human beings. Secondly, lumping all security threats together creates an artificial continuity which rules out the play of policy and, above all, of contingency. I can best illustrate this by reference to the work of Philip Bobbitt. Here's another American academic I'm going to be rude about, who sees the wars of the 20th century, those from 1914 to 1990, as one long war, and uses this as a historical analogy in order to help us understand the long-term challenges posed to liberalism and to what he calls the market state, a concept I still grapple to understand, but that may be my failing. The challenges posed to liberalism and to the market state by terrorism. The Long War became the successor title to the Global War on Terror in the Bush administration, at least 2 years before the Global War on Terror was at least formally declared over by Bush's successor, Barack Obama. But for historians, length, and probably for the rest of us, or the rest of you, I suppose I'm a historian in this context, but for historians, the length of a war, self-evidently, is only clear in retrospect. We're not like Errol Flynn at the beginning of a film which I now can't remember the title of, where he says, breaks in at the beginning and says the 30 Years' War has just begun. The 100 Years' War, which was a series of separable wars, only became known as the 100 Years' War in the 19th century. And exactly the same points could be made not just about the 30 Years' War, but about the 7 Years' War or the 9 Years' War, each of which aggregated a number of separate conflicts, and that is a point particularly true of Bobbitt's Long War of the 20th century. The First World War ended in 1918. Right, you can argue it went on to the early 1920s in various forms, but it's certainly not still going on in 1939. And the peacemakers at Versailles had a truly ambitious vision for a new world order that would ensure the early resolution of international conflict. There was no inevitability about the outbreak of the Second World War as from 1919. Whatever some Germans might have argued, and whatever many Americans, anxious to attack Woodrow Wilson for his failings, have come to believe. Most importantly, between 1914 and 1945, many states had little or limited or even no experience of war. Even the United States only fought intensively between 1917 and 1918 and 1941 and 1945. Switzerland, to take an obvious example, didn't fight at all. Doesn't stop, of course, the Swiss having a war memorial, but that's another issue. And whom they fought changed. Russia was an ally in 1914-17 and again in 1941-45. But the notion of the Long War of the 20th century depends on the clash, or the potential clash, between the United States and the Soviet Union for its longevity. And yet, of course, that clash did indeed remain potential, did indeed remain cold rather than hot, and so isn't really comparable with either the First or the Second World War. And the third point is that, crucially, this sort of lumping, precisely because it rules out contingency, also has little to say about causation, or at least short-term causes. Its fixation is with the longue durée. It is almost Marxist in its approach to the causes of war, seeing war as the product of inevitable clashes. It has little to say about wars that are short, or about wars that are fought between states or groupings that look socially or politically similar, and critically, it doesn't explain the wars that seem to have been inevitable but didn't actually happen. It doesn't address the key issues, which those that in my first lecture I called the practitioners of strategy, as opposed to strategic theorists. It doesn't address the key issues which practitioners of strategy have to address. The when, how, and where will competition over scarce water supplies, or the melting of the polar ice cap, or the lack of fossil fuels? When, how, and where will these actually produce war? Or will these issues actually not lead to war, but be resolved by international or bilateral arbitration? Will diplomacy triumph over militarism? The causes of wars have kept historians of international relations busy since the development of the subject as an academic discipline over a century ago. But diplomatic historians tend to fall silent the moment the bullets start to fly, and only resume their deliberations once the fighting has stopped. There are honourable exceptions. In other words, we know a fair amount about the passage from peace to war, not least because the issue is one of prudential concern. We do actually need to understand how war comes about, not least because we want to try and prevent it happening next time. But we tend to pay less attention to the reverse process, the passage from war to peace. It is a process helpfully captured in international relations terminology by the distinction between conflict termination and conflict resolution. The war needs to be fought through to the point where a strategic decision is evident, where one side knows that militarily it is not going to win. At that point, cost-benefit calculations suggest that the defeated side should enter negotiations with the other side, that is the potential victor. Like war itself, this phase between war and peace remains nested in a bilateral relationship. The side that is winning has to accept the potential surrender of the side that is losing, and has to offer terms that make surrender a palatable option, so much so that the defeated side will actually accept them rather than decide it is better to fight on. Those terms might be minimal. In the ancient world, they might have been no more than a guarantee that the victor will spare the lives of those who surrender. They may be much more generous, as Bismarck was to Austria after the defeat at Königgrätz in 1866. These negotiations are essentially political, because while battle may be an exchange between armies, peace negotiations, at least those involving states, are an exchange between governments. And if a non-state actor is a party, for example in a war of national independence, then the aim is to create a transitional government to enable that passage from war to peace. This is evident in even the most extreme circumstances, even in circumstances where the call is for unconditional surrender. In 1945, the Japanese government was given reassurance that the emperor would not be removed, that some element of continuity would be preserved. In Germany, the Allies negotiated with Karl Dönitz, who, as Hitler's appointed successor, possessed a form of political legitimacy, however shallow it might now seem to us. The presumption within this state-driven model of war termination is that the government is the agency which surrenders. But is that right? There are two other parties, at least within states, with an interest in the outcome, and which may behave differently from their government. The first is the armed forces. Surrender begins with capitulation on the battlefield, with a raising of a white flag, with throwing your hands up, or with a ship striking its colours. The second is the people. The invasion of Iraq in 2003. The second is the people. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 did not anticipate the surrender of Saddam Hussein, but it did anticipate, largely wrongly, a rapturous welcome from his subjects. They, not their leader, would take the decision to surrender. In the transfer from war to peace, these relationships between government, armed forces and people have come to look very different across time, and particularly as democratization has meant that the people are understood to be distinct political actors in their own right and not just subjects of an absolute ruler. I spoke last week quite a bit about the role of booty and plunder in war and how it united both the state and the individual in going to war, not least in the ancient world and in some respects up to the 18th century. By the same token, those motives also help explain how and why wars ended. At the individual level, those who were defeated were either killed or, increasingly, as their asset value was appreciated, passed into slavery or redeemed for ransom. As Genghis Khan is meant to have put it, both pithily and graphically, the great happiness is to vanquish your enemies, and to chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth, to see those dear to them bathed in tears, and to clasp to your bosom their wives and daughters. Possession, not negotiation, was the basis for ending war, and prolonged resistance simply produced obliteration. Think of the fate of Milos at the hands of Athens in 416 BC, when all the adult males were killed and all the women and children were sent into slavery. Or think of Rome's obliteration of Carthage, Carthago delenda est. War was the means to empire, wealth, territory, revenue and population. And once one side had got it, the war ended. But once war was no longer fought for material gain, but for reasons of religion or ideology, its outcomes could seem less clear-cut, and the relationship between victory on the battlefield and the outcome of the war also became less direct. In the 17th and 18th centuries, these issues were confused at both the political and the tactical levels. At the political level, control of territory and resources remained the principal driver in war. From Louis XIV's expansion of France to its natural frontiers, to the competition between France and Britain for control of North America and India. As Montesquieu put it at the outset of L'Esprit des Lois, the object of war is victory, that of victory is conquest, and that of conquest preservation. All very simple. But tactically, 18th century warfare was played out less often on the open battlefield and more through the medium of siege warfare. If the point of war was indeed to preserve or to master territory, then Vauban was the supreme practitioner of the day, the builder of fortifications. Many of those who practiced and thought about 18th century war, like, for example, Maurice de Saxe, counselled against the use of battle as a dodgy and uncertain way of proceeding. And Marlborough may have acquired fame and reputation in a campaign of manoeuvre culminating in a decisive battle at Blenheim in 1704, but the war nonetheless continued for another 9 years, and in that time Marlborough conducted far more sieges than he ever fought battles. Frederick the Great's battlefield masterpiece, Leuthen, fought in 1757, at the outset of the 7 Years' War, may have saved Prussia, at least for the time being, but it certainly didn't end the war. Decisive battles were rare, and even when they occurred, they did not mark the culmination of hostilities. But then in 1815, Waterloo seemed to validate the argument that victory, a tactical outcome on the battlefield, could indeed be decisive at the strategic and political level. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars were bundled together by 19th century military analysts in a very different way from the way in which we now see the 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, the 9 Years' War, or the 7 Years' War. Rather than being seen as the 23 Years' War, a single war of exhaustion, the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars were treated as a series of independent wars, each culminating with a decisive battle, from Valmy to Marengo, from Austerlitz to Jena. The armies of Europe were persuaded that what they did on the battlefield determined the outcome of the war, not what the people did or suffered, not economic exhaustion, not popular uprisings or revolutionary guerrilla war. Waterloo clinched the argument. It consolidated a peace settlement which ensured comparative peace for all but 100 years, at least within Europe. Waterloo formed the climax to Edward Creasy's bestseller, 15 Decisive Battles of the World, published in 1851 and reprinted regularly in innumerable editions and given endlessly as school prizes up until almost the outbreak of the First World War. It begins with Marathon, and it shows the enduring influence of battles on what Creasy called, in his own words, our own social and political condition. The idea of the decisive battle, that tactical success could shape strategic and political outcomes, has cast a long shadow. As late as 1954, Major General J.F.C. Fuller published The Decisive Battles of the Western World and Their Influence Upon History in 3 volumes. Even more revealing of the lessons derived from the wars of 1792 to 1815 were 19th century readings of Clausewitz's On War. The central preoccupation of On War is less the relationship between war and policy, and more that between battle and war, or between tactics and strategy. Strategy was defined by Clausewitz, as I mentioned in my first lecture, as the use of the battle for the purposes of the war. Strategy, in other words, in Clausewitz's eyes, converts tactical success into strategic success through the exploitation of the battle by the pursuit and annihilation of the enemy. In other words, Clausewitz did not claim that battle was decisive. He, after all, had fought at Borodino on the Russian side in 1812 and had seen how what we would now call symmetrical forces could negate each other. But many 19th century military theorists inverted Clausewitz's argument. The aim of manoeuvre was not to exploit the battle after it had been fought and so achieve a decision. Instead, the aim was to bring the enemy to battle because the battle itself was decisive. Colonial warfare in the 19th century encouraged that sort of thinking. The native populations in countries outside Europe possessed strategic advantages. They knew the terrain and the climate, and they were likely to be inured to local diseases and infections, or at least so the argument ran. The discipline, order, and firepower of European armies gave them tactical advantages which offset their strategic inferiority. And so the key message of manuals like Charles Caldwell's Small Wars, published in 1896, was the need for the colonial power to seek battle as soon as possible, and so to use the tactical advantages of discipline and firepower to overcome the strategic disadvantages of being in a pretty alien and difficult climate and terrain. What this meant was that victory would be achieved not by destroying the order of an enemy army, but by killing. Clausewitz had used the word Vernichtung, or annihilation, to describe what happened to an army in the pursuit after battle. That word is now, for us, redolent of genocide and the Holocaust. But Clausewitz made clear that what he meant to convey was the process by which an army became a rabble and so ceased to exist. Isabel Hull, in her study of the German conquest of southwest Africa in 1904, used the title Absolute Destruction for her book. Because there, in what is now Namibia, in a non-European context, the German army did engage in the genocide of the Herero people. By 1914, many 20th century generals had come to believe, in a way that many 18th century generals had not, that battle was inherently decisive, and that strategy existed to make possible a tactical decision not to exploit the tactical events which constitute fighting. So the key was to get the enemy to commit himself to battle. Both sides did that with pretty regular frequency in the First World War, but no decision resulted. Tactics trumped strategy. When the war ended in 1918, it did so without a decisive military outcome, without the equivalent of a Battle of Waterloo, with a whimper more than a bang. The German army was still in France, intact and claiming it was undefeated. It was certainly not annihilated in either Karl von Clausewitz's or in Isabel Hull's sense. It was therefore hard to see the connections between the culminating events on the different fronts and the peace settlements negotiated at Versailles, particularly, but not only, in Germany's case, even where it could be argued that there had been decisive battles, at Vittorio Veneto in Italy, at Mosul in what is now in Iraq, or at Megiddo in Palestine. The link between those events and what was decided in France in 1919 and the subsequent settlements seemed unclear. So by the 1930s, the link between the battlefield and the peace settlement had been broken. And that was not just the product of the German army's argument that it had not been defeated on the battlefield but had been stabbed in the back by revolution at home. It was also fed by the sense that the victory of 1918 had not led to peace. This frustration underpinned the idea of unconditional surrender in the Second World War. To be sure, unconditional surrender may have been a formula which held together an alliance possessed of incompatible post-war political objectives, but its drivers were as much retrospective as prospective. As Paul Keksameti, writing in 1958 about surrender in the Second World War, observed, instead of planning to settle the problems germane to World War II, they, that is the Allies, resolved to end it by doing everything that would have been needed to prevent it from breaking out. So unconditional surrender was a formula that endeavoured to roll together the military process of capitulation on the battlefield and the political decision to end the war. It was, in this sense, a reversion to the norms of the ancient or medieval worlds. The challenge which it confronted was the lack of a political actor who was legitimate in the eyes of the Allies and with whom they could therefore deal, even assuming the readiness of Germany to negotiate. In the ancient world, this political impasse would have been resolved by the destruction of the enemy's fighting capacity, by annihilation, by Vernichtung, by the triumph of the means of war over policy. But the two world wars do not provide much evidence that mass surrender is, in its own right, independently of other variables, sufficient to cause state collapse. And here I disagree with a set of arguments on the political economy of prisoner-taking, which has been advanced by Neil Ferguson. The acknowledgement of belligerent rights and the recognition of the status of the prisoner of war, that he was not the possession of his captor, but should be returned home at the end of the war, having been fed and accommodated during the course of the war by his enemy, that status was evident by the late 18th century and was acknowledged by the leaders of the French Revolution. It was embodied in the Liber Code in the American Civil War, in the Brussels Rules of 1874, and in the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. It putatively changed the relationship between the commander and those whom he led, giving them the opportunity, if they could, to negotiate the terms on which they fought, so that they did not obey orders, literally, to fight to the last man and to the last round. Len Smith, in his wonderful study of the French Fifth Corps in the First World War, shows how this negotiation between leader and led worked. And it even applied in Nazi Germany. At Stalingrad, von Paulus led his army into captivity, much to the fury of Hitler, just as General Percival surrendered his forces at Singapore in February 1942. Collective surrender avoided the useless wastes of life and was rationalized on this basis. It was deemed to be prudential and could even be honorable, at least on a humanitarian, if not on a national level. Those who did not surrender, like the Japanese in the Second World War, were no longer deemed courageous, like the 300 at Thermopylae, but fanatical and even subhuman. They were denigrated by their enemies, not lauded. But many mass surrenders, including those at Stalingrad and Singapore, were not in themselves decisive in terms of their eventual effects on the outcome of the war. The same point could be made about the mass Russian surrenders after the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, or about the Great Retreat of the Russians in 1915, or about the Italian surrenders after Caporetto in October and November 1917, or even about in relation to the surrenders of British troops to Germans in the Fifth Army in the March 1918 offensives. I mentioned last week the high numbers of missing, presumed to be either deserters or prisoners of war, in the British Eighth Army in the summer of 1942. But Britain still ended up on the winning side. Japanese rarely surrendered in the Second World War, but they still ended up on the losing side. When the medieval economic historian, a man, of course, whom I also mentioned in the first lecture, when the medieval economic historian Marc Bloch addressed the defeat of France in 1940, yet again a case of a decisive German victory which did not in fact decide the outcome of the war as a whole, Bloch called it a strange defeat. He equated individual surrender with the surrender of the nation. But for a Frenchman, a French patriot, and a French nationalist, as Bloch was, and a man for whom the nation in arms was a living reality — he had, after all, served in the French army in 2 world wars, as well, of course, as an analyst — the implication was that surrender followed not from the annihilation of an army, but from a collective decision by the people of France. This was the other approach, which could resolve the political impasse created by unconditional surrender. The idea of the people, rather than of the government, as the legitimate negotiating party to a surrender. It rests surely on the democratizing legacy of the French Revolution, as do the legal rights of prisoners of war captured doing their military duty as citizens. But it also assumes the capacity of strategic effects in war to separate the people of a country from its government, or to ensure that the people can bring overwhelming pressure to bear on their government, even to the point of revolution. After 1918, the blockade of Germany, if it really had precipitated the German Revolution, and if that revolution had indeed caused the defeat of Germany, both, of course, hotly debated questions, suggested that the German people had been persuaded by the effects of war to topple a war-making regime in order to replace that government with a peace-loving and even potentially democratic government. Much Allied First World War propaganda rested on that presumption, that the Kaiser, mustachioed and helmeted, was the embodiment of German militarism, but that the German people were potentially decent liberal Democrats. In the Second World War, the strategic bombing offensive, like the blockade of the First World War, used a similar mix of stick and fairly inedible carrot. The German people could be persuaded, through bombing, to get angry, not with the Allies, but with Hitler, who had indirectly brought this suffering upon them. In both wars, Allied ignorance of the dynamics of the relationship between government and people rested on preconceptions that were as culturally conditioned and as driven by uncertain or inadequate intelligence as those that shaped Allied behaviour and expectations in relation to Iraq in 2 Gulf Wars, or seemed to continue sometimes to shape expectations in Afghanistan. The bonds between Hitler, the German army, and the German people proved much more resilient than any of the calculations resting on the presumption either of a general's coup against Hitler or a popular revolution. The perception that the pursuit of unconditional victory had not in fact produced a worthwhile peace in 1945, a perception which had become an axiom by the mid-1950s as the Cold War became entrenched, converged with the implications for the conduct of war of the adoption of nuclear weapons. The possibility of an all-out nuclear exchange suggested that future war would produce no victory that was worth the name to either side, let alone leave in place governments which would be able to negotiate a surrender. So the move from strategic effect to political resolution would itself be impossible because there would be no governments to do the negotiating. As a result, the just war tradition, under the pressure of nuclear deterrence, became less focused on just cause and more on right effect. Could you claim, if and when you embarked on a war, that you would leave the world in a better place when the war was over? Most strategic thinkers of the nuclear age answered no, but that in itself led those who still argued for the need for a concept of victory within a nuclear war, for example, Colin Gray, to put the case that in that event, much of nuclear deterrence theory rested on immoral foundations. That the need for right effect compelled the theorists of nuclear deterrence precisely because deterrence had to rest on a credible threat that you would actually use nuclear weapons and go to war, compelled nuclear deterrence theory to find solutions which enabled a positive outcome to a nuclear exchange. It would be easy to draw a straight line from the 1950s through the Cold War until today, to argue that our doubts about the validity of victory within war are simply a continuation of the Cold War and have outlasted its end, and that they are now projected onto the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Victory there is defined in terms of creating conditions sufficiently secure to enable the intervening powers to get out. Our exit strategy, a phrase which itself captures exactly the confusion of means and ends. Surely exit cannot be the political objective of the war. And assuming exit is not the political objective of the war, an exit strategy creates uncertainty as to what the real objective in the war is. After all, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, an exit may make for conflict termination for the intervening powers, but it does not amount to conflict resolution for the two countries' inhabitants. However, the concept of victory did resurface in the Cold War, and albeit on the conventional level and as an operational concept within NATO armies in the 1980s. In non-nuclear war and at the tactical level, gaining or holding ground, to give you an obvious example, or winning a firefight when your own survival and the lives of your immediate comrades are at stake, remains as important, as central, as big a driver to victory as it did on the beaches of Normandy. Here, in that tactical level, victory retains meaning. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and in northern Germany, as the British and German armies considered how to meet a massive Soviet invasion by offensive counterstrokes in the 1980s, that tactical idea of victory served two purposes. It reinvigorated the morale of NATO armies and air forces, particularly those of the United States, and secondly, it gave them a positive form of war into which to sink their intellectual teeth. Its results became known as air-land battle and manoeuvre warfare. Those concepts, designed for operational success in Northern Europe in the 1980s, were applied with stunning success in Gulf War I, and were then refined and perfected in the 1990s, particularly through improved technologies, but also through successive intellectual constructs going under the names of the Revolution in Military Affairs, Network-Centric Warfare, Transformation, and so on. In May 2003, at what he thought was the end of the Second Gulf War, President Bush was able to declare mission accomplished. A short campaign had apparently been crowned with decisive battle, and the Second Gulf War seemed set to join the German wars of unification, or the war in the Falklands, or even the Kosovo campaign, as an example where a short decisive war fulfilled the ends of policy, at least for the victors. This sense of victory, as understood in military terms, as opposed to its strategic outcomes or its political effects, also dogged Bush's understanding of the global war on terror. As late as October 2005, Bush deployed the vocabulary of the Second World War in relation to the global war on terror, that vocabulary of total war and unconditional surrender. He said, "Against such an enemy, there is only one effective response. We will never back down, never give in, and never accept anything less than complete victory." This conflation of military success and political surrender, this legacy of the notion of decisive battle, is not simply delusional in relation to the global war on terror or in relation to counterinsurgency campaigns. It is pretty far-fetched in any war. If anybody had read the thoughts of Chairman Mao to President Bush in 2005, Bush wasn't listening. As Mao wrote in On Protracted War in 1938, rapid victory, in his words, consists only in one's mind and not in objective reality. It is a mere illusion, a false theory. For every short campaign culminating in decisive battle, there have been many more where the apparently decisive battle, as in May 2003, has been followed by further campaigns and even ultimate defeat. In protracted wars, exhaustion rather than annihilation become the means to strategic effect, and the end is more likely to be negotiation, as each side moderates its terms to meet the demands of the enemy. More importantly, the military means, because they become the indicators of relative advantage, of progress in the war, can become more important than the political objectives. Metrics. The metrics of the body count in the First World War or in Vietnam. The metrics of economic hardship created by the blockade, or the metrics of the destruction of cities through bombing in the Second World War. The metrics of poppy cultivation in Afghanistan, or of the numbers of Taliban leaders killed by drone attacks in Pakistan. The metrics of popular support at home or in theatre in any war. All these create targets and indications of success in their own right, and can too easily result in the means becoming the ends. As they do so, they shape the political objectives and the final outcome of the war. To revert again to a point I've made already, war, particularly protracted war, comes to master policy. Whoever imagined that Clausewitz's norm, that war was the continuation of policy by other means, reflected a consistent reality, hadn't read much military history. If states or any other organizations go to war in order to fulfill specific policy objectives, then they need to be much more aware than they ever appear to be that war changes policy, even when wars are wars decided in short order. Wars are very rarely continuations of the policy which brought them into being, particularly when the terms on which they end are used as criteria. Nonetheless, Clausewitz's dictum suggests that war has a use, that it has in some senses a rational rather than an irrational basis, that it does remain a policy option. The great crisis in Clausewitz's life, or at least in his life as a military theorist, came in 1827, when he realized that what he called the absolute wars of Napoleon, the foundation stone of his theory and his own military experience, that all that, which of course was bound up with the survival of his own state, that of Prussia, was not the only war that had occurred in man's history, and that his theory needed to encapsulate other sorts of wars, and particularly more limited and contained forms of war. The resolution of this crisis was a more mature theory, one that embraced these two forms of war and gave them a common identity through their shared relationship to policy. Clausewitz was one of the first writers to formulate a theory of limited war, a body of thought developed and sustained in Britain by Julian Corbett before the First World War, and then given fresh life in the aftermath of the Korean War by Robert Osgood. For the United States, doctrines of limited war were crushed by defeat in Vietnam. But today's war in Afghanistan is, for the NATO powers, also a limited war, confined geographically and constrained in terms of its resource commitments and in its levels of national mobilization. Less clear is whether the war in Afghanistan is limited in its political objectives, whether those objectives are focused on the precise issue of counterterrorism or universalized through their humanitarian goals. As a result of this confusion as to its objectives, the war in Afghanistan is itself shaping policy. The challenge for us today is whether we can get our heads around war in terms that are other than existential, that move on from a vocabulary still locked in the legacies of the two world wars and the Cold War. For many in the West, and particularly for our own governments, the war in Afghanistan is a war for the survival of beliefs we held to be central to our humanity, those of religious freedom, legal rights, of democracy, beliefs which elevate the necessity of the war and seem to make it a continuation of policy. But it is just that elevation, manifested in our focus on the just war tradition, and specifically on jus ad bellum, on the justice of going to war, which radicalizes our reasons for fighting and makes it hard to negotiate a compromise, or even find an exit strategy, and which perversely ensures that war directs policy. Our need is not to renounce war as a political tool, but to think through with much greater rigor and pragmatism the implications of the doctrine of right effect, to think through the possible consequences of fighting, recognizing that war is not a unilateral use of force, but a reciprocal exchange which possesses its own dynamic and to whose evolution we must pay constant, sustained, and critical attention. Thank you very much.